into a very remote section of Afghanistan because a patrol had basically gone missing.
Exactly.
And just
Well,
no one was around for months.
Well,
So very remote.
Yeah, very remote. So we flew in to about 4 kilometers. We're hiking through the same area where they were supposed to be one of their checkpoints, the route. And before we left, there was all kinds of what happened with the ambush. That was even odd because at the point of the ambush, the call from me was there's something. There was no call from me, just off the route. So we're coming down a mountainside, and there was a nice path, good path. As we bent around this corner, you can see this open of the cave. There's a cave. We're coming around. And then I see there's a lot of rocks, which is another oddity, and then bone matter. When I'm not close enough to identify what kind of bones, but I did see something I knew was a piece of our communication equipment. So instantly, we're thinking ambush, maybe animal, it could be anything. There was enough room in front of this cave, but it had a sheer drop off. But there was enough room that we actually got into a decent dispersal in case of ambush.
You see something coming out of the cave, and it's moving with a speed and agility that catches you off guard. Everybody.
And he comes out. There was a man at least 12 to 15 feet away. This is a monster. Red beard, then his hair was long past the shoulder, a scarlet red. And Dan runs at him, started shooting, broke all of us into the out. Because it was
So
surreal.
now your training is kicking in.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
muscle memory, complete muscle memory. While Dan is moving at him, another bro of mine's laying down fire, and I start firing. He skewers Dan. He's now got him on this pipe. It went through. He's still got him, and he's coming after more. We all just clicked in. I don't know what it was, but I remember we're all like, shoot him in the face, shoot him in the face. Our weapons components were in force. We had real 8s, and we had Barrett 50s. This is sounding longer than it took. We're talking 30 seconds. And he's taking multiple hits, and it's still moving, and it's still moving.
Interior cargo lights turned red, indicating that the C-17 military aircraft had just entered Afghanistan airspace. 32 minutes later, the aircraft descended into a steep landing approach. The pilots wanted to get out of the air as quickly as possible without crashing, so they didn't become a Taliban target. During the mid-1980s, Russian invasion, the CIA supplied Stinger missiles to the Afghan fighters to shoot down Russian planes. These same weapons were used to take down U.S. aircrafts. One passenger, Chase, a CIA special ops agent, was not old enough to remember the Russian invasion, but he'd heard enough stories from the older agents to know it was a modern-day disaster and another great loss for the agency. As the plane's landing gear lowered, the seasoned soldiers leaned away from the windows of the plane to avoid a sniper's bullet. The new arrivals followed without having to be ordered. Chase had been here enough to know, it is the pilots the snipers wanted. The ramp opened immediately after the plane landed. All the men that piled out onto the tarmac would be going with Chase the very next morning and into the Kandahar mountain system. That evening, the camp commander, Major Campbell, gave a briefing about the next day's mission. 1 week ago, an Army infantry unit, while on patrol, went into the Kandahar mountains and vanished. Prior to their disappearance, there was no communication and no TIC, short for troops in contact. Before daybreak, a C-47 Chinook will be dropping you off, in the same location the missing infantry was known to be. Lieutenant Murray, and Clark, you do not need to know his last name, I'm not sure he even has a last name, will lead you into the area where we believe the troops would have been. We suspect that the Taliban most likely killed them. It is your mission to retrieve the bodies, any weapons and equipment, and call in a chopper for retrieval. The CO asked Chase if he had anything to add. The agent shook his head no. I advise all of you go to the mess hall and eat all the carbs you can. They will be better for your stamina than meat. The major advised, I'll see you when you get back. The men felt some reassurance that the major was confident they were coming back. Morning came quickly. The 8 men were already off and in the air. After a 40-minute ride, the Army Ranger offloaded, not knowing if this would be an ambush. At once their training kicked in and they assumed defensive positions with their weapons pointing in every direction. After a moment of calm, where every man heard himself breathing, there was no enemy fire. The lieutenant motioned for 2 men to move forward and take point. They tactfully advanced in the direction of the mountains, then stopped to take up a position of suppressing fire. One of the men signaled an all clear, and the lieutenant sent 2 more men forward to overtake the first men's position. This type of maneuver continued until all 8 men were against base of the mountain without incident. Just ahead is what looked like a wide animal path, maybe even a goat trail. The lieutenant motioned for his point men to recon the top of the trail. Just around the corner, they found debris, torn and bloody uniforms, broken and shattered equipment and weapons laid scattered everywhere. The lieutenant and Chase crouched behind a large boulder, and it didn't take long before one of the men that took point to come back around the side of the trail so his team could see him. He gave a hand signal for the lieutenant to join them. Chase at once rushed up the trail without waiting for the lieutenant. Chase was not in the same shape as the Army Rangers, so at the top of the trail where the 2 recon soldiers waited, out of breath, he dropped to the dirt and unsuccessfully fumbled for his canteen. Without looking back, one of the Rangers offered Chase his canteen. Chase took it and gave him a winded thanks. After a brief discussion, the lieutenant signaled the rest of the men to join them. At the top of the trail was a rocky outcrop, a rock shelf, with 3 cave openings. There was no safe place to take cover, so 2 men stayed on the trail, with the other 6 soldiers, including Chase, and sought a covered position just off the trail and onto the mountain slope of fallen rock. Lieutenant Murray nodded for Corporal Mason, one of the men still on the trail, to investigate the cave's entrance. As Mason rose from his lowered position, a giant spear with a stone tip launched from the darkness of the center cave opening and pierced through the body of Corporal Mason and into the rock wall behind him. The men waited for the lieutenant's order to fire. Lieutenant Murray, so shocked at what he saw, froze. Then, from the center cave, appeared a 12 to 15 foot tall giant with long red hair on his shoulders and red beard. The monster of a man had to lean down to exit the cave opening. Immediately all 7 of the remaining men were overcome by the foul stench of wretched rotten flesh. Without any hesitation, the giant ran directly towards the fallen man to retrieve his spear. The second man on the trail didn't wait for the lieutenant's order to fire. He opened up, and as he did so his entire squad opened fire on the red-haired giant dressed in animal skins. As fast as Corporal Mason died, so did the giant. The giant's body was riddled with bullet holes and his head was partially missing on the left side from a 50mm round. 2 men dead, 1 a decorated Army Ranger, the other a giant from ancient stories told by old Afghan men around a night fire. The soldiers rushed to the corporal's body. The radio man called for an evac. Chase, the CIA agent, called for another chopper to take away the giant. He climbed up to the rocky outcrop to get a better look at the creature. The giant's blood was red, much darker than the creature's hair. Chase was the only one not shocked at what they discovered. He knew what they were going to find. This wasn't the first time men were reported missing because of a giant red-headed man monster. On the ground, outside the 3 caves, were bones, lots of bones. Human bones and animal bones mixed together, one on top of the other. He began to worry that there might be a female or even child nearby. The smell of death was so strong, Clark almost retched. Flies were swarming the cave opening. It looked like the monster ate the meat off the bones and tossed the bones. Chase didn't see enough human bones in front of the cave openings to account for all the lost men. There must be more inside, maybe people caged for later meals or even hanging from the ceiling being bled out. Chase shined his flashlight into the cave and across the ceiling. This wasn't a government-issue flashlight, this was a 1 million lumens he purchased from the internet himself. The light illuminated the entire inside of the cave. In his other hand, he held his semi-automatic .45. The cave floor was carpeted with more bones and a stronger odor, the smell of death that had always been with him. He called out for 2 men with lights to go with him. Lieutenant Murray set up 2 rangers that were eager for payback for what happened to Mason. Clark didn't mind they were gung-ho. Clark then thought through the emotion of watching Mason die. Reason took hold and he didn't see any logical explanation to kill any more of these creatures. It would be better to take them alive. He told the 2 men to return down the path. Just as they backed out, he heard a moaning cry from deep in the mountain cavern.
We left backroom, still pitch black, wearing NVGs as we rode through the hot desert night. I was constantly scanning the perimeter, waiting to be ambushed on the roads. I looked back at the huge, bearded team guys. They were all looking straight ahead. They all seemed to know something that I didn't. They had zero concern for the road and seemed to be a million miles away in their minds. It was as if the real threat far exceeded what we had seen from the Hajis en route. We hit the LSA mountains a couple hours later, pulling into a small combat outpost and dismounting. Ammo, grenades, water, and NVGs. It's all that Captain Stone said. I grabbed my assault pack as one of the team guys tossed me a few grenades and extra mags. We stepped off from the command outpost, moving up the mountain in a wedge formation. I remember thinking we were invincible as I looked at the huge warriors carrying M4s, SCARs, M2 sniper rifles, and grenade launchers. These guys had probably taken down entire Al-Qaeda units by themselves. They had the look, the one you earn from taking the lives of other men. I felt like I was superhuman. Little did I know what awaited us. We came upon the cave just as the sun was cresting the mountain. The sky was blood red as the darkness faded into oblivion. The cave looked like the mouth of a giant serpent. The opening was on the other side of a sheer ledge that stood 10 to 15 feet high. As we approached, Captain Stone said, "Eyes up, keep your distance." As we got within 100 meters of the cave, I saw something shiny on the ground. I signaled for the squad to halt and called Captain Stone over. It was a radio. The mic had been ripped off and the radio had a massive dent. Dried black blood caked the side of it. Chunks of skin and tissue littered the area. Captain Stone said, "Shit, James," as his face turned to anger. He stood up as one of the team guys pulled out some climbing gear. He fastened it and we all climbed the ropes as silently as we could. I was last to climb, cresting the ledge and seeing the squad in prone, pointing their weapons at the cave opening. As soon as I was up, the squad stood and started to move slowly towards the cave. He, one of the team guys, took point and took a few steps toward the cave. I was overcome with the worst smell imaginable, like sulfur, shit, and rotten milk. I began to get an intense feeling of despair and hopelessness. It wasn't the adrenaline rush and heightened senses of a normal engagement. It felt evil. Just as E put his hand up to motion for us to stop. I heard the deepest, loudest roar emanate from the cave. It sounded like a cross between a man yelling and the roar of a lion, but blended in an impossible manner. Before we knew it, something huge came charging out of the cave and impaled E with a massive spear, lifting him 15 feet off of the ground. I looked in amazement at what looked like a huge man. It was absolutely massive, standing 13 to 14 feet tall, its shoulders as wide as I am tall. It had long red hair and a shaggy red beard. It had a loincloth on and leather sacks on its feet. We were all momentarily frozen. There was an absolute sense of pure unbridled evil that emanated from this thing. Finally, Captain Stone yelled, "Headshots!" We all unleashed a barrage of rounds into its head and face. 9 soldiers, all emptying 2 to 3 magazines worth of ammo into the beast. It dropped E, who was still skewered on the spear and began to charge me, the ground shaking with every step. It looked at me with such cruelty and disdain, open mouth revealing 2 rows of giant teeth. I felt like an ant that was about to be stomped on by a child. It yelled something in another language that I didn't understand, its voice splitting my eardrums. As it reached out its massive hand to grab me, it finally fell, riddled with bullets. Its head and face caved in. Captain Stone empties another magazine of 7.62 in the giant's head before going to check on E's body. It took 3 of us to lift the spear and another 2 to pull E's body off of the spear shaft, which makes a sucking noise as we pull him off. The spear had ripped out his entire chest cavity. His ribs were splintered and sticking straight out, like crooked, jagged teeth. All of his internal organs lay in a pile on the desert floor, the 5 of us covered in his warm, sticky blood. Captain Stone called in the sit rep and requested transport. We all sat down for what seemed like an eternity of silence. Normally, after a mission, we joke around and tell the most inappropriate stories. It's tradition and makes the horror of war feel a little more acceptable. Today was different. Every eye was glazed over. Everyone sat, facing away from the giant. We had seen, felt real evil. This thing was not a man. Being in its presence brought a feeling of hopelessness that I can't begin to describe. It was like all of the joy, hope, and good had been sucked out of the world, replaced by despair and agony. We finally stood up and examined the beast. It had 6 fingers on each hand. Its hands were large enough to wrap around my torso. Its mouth revealed 2 rows of teeth, with each teeth being the length of my finger. The hair on its head and beard was an unnatural shade of red. I wrapped my hands around one of its fingers in an attempt to lift its arm. I couldn't even get its hand off of the ground. The spear, still dripping with blood, weighed as much as the logs we use in training that require 6 men to lift above our heads. We stepped into the cave, seeing hundreds of human bones. Chunks of skin, tissue, and military uniforms littered the pile. In the corner were hundreds of weapons. Modern guns like M4s and FALs, rusted out AK-47s, and ancient, rotting swords, spears, and shields. It's like it was keeping trophies